Hey TechKnowStuds, in this video, we're going to talk about firewalls. Firewalls are the front door to your network, and we really want our front door to be secure. It's the gateway into the rest of the network. So it's really critical that you have an up-to-date firewall and that it's operating correctly. We not only have a firewall on the front of our network, but we also, for extra protection, put firewalls on each of our devices as well. It's a pretty critical part to our network, so let's get into firewalls. In this video, all about firewalls, surprise, we're gonna start out by talking about firewalls. Then we're gonna get into next generation firewalls. As I mentioned, firewalls is going to be something that we want to put at the very front of our network. And it's a guard, it's the front door, it's the what is going to allow certain things to pass into the network and certain things to stay outside of the network, or it's going to block certain traffic. And so we have a bunch of resources back here, much of which we don't ever want to expose to the outside world. We also have a network that's hanging off here to the right side as well. So the idea, or one of the ideas behind these firewalls, is that you have an outside and then there is an inside. And perhaps you have something like a DMZ. And so the inside is all going to be protected, and you don't want things to be able to access it from outside the world. Except for if a user goes and wants to get certain information, you want that traffic to be able to return in. So one of the key parts of a firewall is not just to flat out block all traffic. If it were to block all traffic, then you couldn't get any network access. The packets have to be returned. The packets have to come back in. And so what we do is we have this firewall records what requests go to the outside world, and then allows the response to come back into this network. So that is primarily how firewalls work. And in this example right here, we have kind of these different areas. Like I mentioned, we have an outside, we have an inside, and we have a DMZ. And the inside, for the most part, we don't want anything to access it unless it's, once again, it's a reply to some sort of information that we've requested. But the DMZ is a little different. The DMZ, the idea behind the DMZ is that we have this less secure network, or we have this network that is blocked just like the inside network, except for there's a few holes that are poking in for services. For instance, maybe this is a web server right here. And what we want to do is we want to allow people from the outside to be able to get to this web server right here. So we open up a port 80 to whatever IP address is back here. And so then traffic is allowed to reach this web server only on port 80, or maybe it's only on port 80 and 443, or maybe you have some other service like SSH that's running on there that perhaps you've opened up to the outside world. But we have a limited number of ports that are opened up to any resources that's in this DMZ. Now, another reason for this DMZ as well is that if there was something that were to be compromised in here, let's say somebody compromises this server right here, then you still wouldn't have access to the inside network. So this DMZ does not have access to the inside network. So that it's kind of like a double stage in there where things can go from this inside network to the other areas, but they can't get into this inside network. And then this network right here can get out, but outside can't get into this network, with the exception of those services that we specifically open up. So that's a firewall for you. And the way we control this is through access control lists, or Cisco actually calls it a little different. We're going to get into access control lists. We're going to get into access control statements that we'll create. So we'll get all into that, but just know for Firewall here, it's a critical part on the front of your network that's going to guard a lot of that traffic from getting into your network. There's this term, Next Generation Firewall. And really what that's, well, one thing is it always makes me laugh when they include something like next generation in there, because what happens when that gets outdated, and we've used this term next generation, kind of like my own Microsoft used new technology, or, you know, anyways, really what primarily the way firewalls work is they will block or accept traffic based off of IP and port. Well, next generation firewalls is capable of doing much more than that. So there are more advanced features. So when we hear next generation firewall, just think that there's more advanced features. So we're going to go over a few of those advanced features that you may see on a next generation firewall. One of the differences is the older firewalls are stateful versus the new firewalls are stateless. And really what that means is stateful just means that it goes through and looks at the packet and determines whether it's going to be accepted or not. Once again, kind of the IP/port idea of it. But stateless does a little bit more, obviously. Stateless actually goes in and can monitor multiple packets and see trends that are happening across multiple packets. So the idea behind this is they're state aware. They're able to see the trends of these different packets that are going through there. So think multi-packet when you're thinking stateless. And one area where that comes into effect is that it is capable of doing deep packet inspection, or DPI. And so here's the example of a packet right here. We have our layer 1, we have our layer 2, layer 3, layer 4. So typical firewalls stay once again in this IP and port, which we find in the layer 3 and layer 4. But deep packet inspection allows us to take a much deeper look into the application and seeing what's happening in the application layer. And that's one reason why we would want this to be stateful, is because we want to see what's happening within the application layer here. Perhaps there's a virus that's being sent over this application layer here, or perhaps there's something that's happening in there that the firewall can look in there, do a deep packet inspection, realize it, that of what's being sent over this series of packets, and then stop the remaining packets so that maybe the full virus doesn't get downloaded. So that's kind of the concept of this deep packet inspection and being stateful. Cisco has their Cisco Application Visibility and Control, or AVC. And so what this is it uses DPI to take a look at the application layer. So this is the software, this is the features that actually dig down into the application and start filtering based off of that deep packet inspection. Similar to next generation firewalls, we also have next generation intrusion prevention systems. And just like the name implies, next generation intrusion prevention systems is just more advanced features of the intrusion prevention systems. So as we mentioned before in our last video, intrusion prevention systems just allow to watch and monitor traffic and see an active attack that's trying to be taken on your network, and then it will take action to stop that attack. So next generation intrusion prevention systems has additional capabilities to stop that from happening. Now, the real key point that you're going to have to know for the test is about next generation intrusion prevention systems is there's both an inline and then there's what's called a promiscuous mode. So inline just means that we would have some sort of device that we put in here that would monitor all of the traffic that's coming through it. Now, the advantage of this is that once it determines that there's some sort of intrusion happening onto your network, it will stop it from happening right away. It's in line, so it controls all of the data that's going through it. Now, it's a single point of failure, or could be a single point of failure. So you may or may not want this to be inline. There is also something called promiscuous mode. And in a scenario like that, maybe what we have is, instead of our intrusion protection system installed inline, maybe we just have a switch, and we then send a duplicate of the traffic that's coming into this switch, we send to another device over here. And that device over here is the intrusion prevention system, and we call this promiscuous mode. And in promiscuous mode, a copy of all the traffic gets sent over to it. It determines what is going on the network. Now, we can't actively just stop the packet that's already going through to the rest of the network, but any future packets, part of that same series of packets, it can then notify that, hey, we need to stop this from happening. And that's when it will take action to stop that intrusion from happening. So that is promiscuous mode right there. And this switch right here, I've actually used a hub before that will duplicate that traffic, or Cisco has a command on there that will duplicate the traffic coming into a port, can duplicate it on another port, or traffic that's going out of a port duplicated on another port. So that's how you would set up this promiscuous mode for next generation intrusion prevention systems. There's quite a few different services that we could mention with our next generation firewalls, but the last one that we're going to cover is this URL filtering. So the idea behind URL filtering is it's a web filter. So if there is certain certain sites that you want to filter, then that information, that traffic is not going to be allowed into your network. And you could be filtering it based off of, I've seen where there's like students who shouldn't be going to certain sites, whether it's because of productivity or because of other reasons, then it will create some filters so that way students can't get to those sites. So that would be an example of it. I have heard of businesses implementing URL filtering as well, but it's not as common as like schools would be. So that's URL filtering. It's just a web filtering to make sure that people can't get to certain sites. There you have it, firewalls. So those firewalls, we talked about firewalls and some of the features that would come in a next generation firewall.